The night of August 6, 1943. Vella Gulf, Solomon Islands. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger stands in the darkened Combat Information Center of USS Dunlap, watching the green glow of the radar scope paint a picture no human eye could see. 3 miles to starboard, his 5 other destroyers cut through black water under a moonless sky. And 13 miles ahead, invisible in the tropical darkness, 4 Japanese destroyers are steaming straight toward him. The Japanese don't know he's there. They can't know. Their hydrophones aren't sensitive enough to detect propeller noise at this range, and they don't have radar comparable to the American SG surface search system painting Moosbrugger's screen. Captain Kaju Sugiura, commanding the Japanese formation, believes the nearest American warships are at the southern end of Vela Gulf, maybe 40 miles distant. He's wrong by 37 miles, and that mistake is about to cost him 3 ships and over 1,000 men. But Moosbrugger knows something else, something that's about to change the balance of power in the Pacific War. The destroyers under his command aren't the undermanned, undergunned tin cans that fought at Guadalcanal a year ago. These are Fletcher-class destroyers, the most successful destroyer design ever built by the United States Navy. And they carry a weapon the Japanese naval staff doesn't fully understand yet. 10 torpedoes, 2 quintuple mounts, 24 warheads about to enter the water simultaneously from 3 ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Fletcher class represented a revolution in American destroyer design, though few people outside naval architecture circles understood why. When the design process began in the fall of 1939, American destroyers had been constrained by the naval disarmament treaties since the 1920s. Those treaties limited displacement, which forced brutal compromises. You could have speed or guns or torpedoes, but never all 3. You could have endurance or armor, but not both. Every destroyer class built between 1922 and 1938 represented a different answer to an impossible equation. The Benson and Gleaves classes, completed in 1940–41, typified the problem. Good ships, competent designs, but cramped, unstable, and overloaded. They carried 5 5-inch guns and 2 quintuple torpedo mounts, 10 torpedoes total. In theory, that was adequate. But in practice, these ships were so top-heavy that later units were completed with only 1 torpedo mount and 4 guns instead of 5, sacrificing firepower to avoid capsizing in heavy seas. Then the treaties lapsed. War erupted in Europe in September 1939, and suddenly American naval architects could ignore the displacement limits that had handcuffed them for 17 years. The Fletcher-class design jumped to 2050 tons, standard displacement, 450 tons more than the Gleaves class. That doesn't sound like much, but it changed everything. With that extra displacement came structural strength, a flush deck hull, eliminating the raised forecastle that created stability problems in earlier classes. Machinery spaces arranged in alternating fire rooms and engine rooms so that a single hit couldn't cripple the ship. Splinter protection around vital spaces using STS special treatment steel plating. And most importantly, enough reserve buoyancy to accommodate weapons and equipment that didn't even exist when the design was finalized. 5 5-inch, 38 caliber guns in enclosed mounts, guns that could engage surface targets at 15,000 yards or aircraft at 30,000 feet altitude, firing 15 rounds per minute from each barrel. 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple centerline mounts, each. Tube loaded with a Mark 15 torpedo carrying 661 pounds of Torpex explosive, and anti-aircraft armament that would grow from a handful of light weapons in 1942 to nearly 20 Bofors and Oerlikon guns by 1945, without sacrificing the torpedoes or main battery. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards launched 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, more than any other destroyer class in history. They became the workhorses of the Pacific Fleet, screening carriers, bombarding beaches, hunting submarines, and fighting surface actions from the Aleutians to the Philippines. but in mid-1943, their most important contribution was just beginning, and it centered on those two quintuple torpedo mounts. The Japanese Navy had owned the night in 1942. Their long-lance torpedoes outranged anything the Americans possessed, traveling 40,000 yards at 49 knots with an 1,100-pound warhead. Japanese destroyer crews trained relentlessly for night combat, developing tactics that emphasized aggressive torpedo attacks followed by rapid withdrawal. At Salvo Island in August 1942, at Tassafaronga in November, at Kolombangara in July 1943, Japanese destroyers had systematically devastated American and Allied cruiser forces in night surface actions. American torpedo tactics in 1942 were frankly dismal. Doctrine emphasized gun action over torpedo attacks. Destroyers operated as screens for cruisers rather than independent striking forces. And the Mark 15 torpedo, while mechanically reliable, had a range of only 6,000 yards at high-speed setting, roughly a third of the Long Lance's capability. American commanders treated torpedoes almost as afterthoughts, weapons to be used only after closing to gun range. More critically, American destroyers operating with cruiser forces couldn't maneuver freely. When a cruiser commander ordered his destroyers to maintain screening positions, those destroyers couldn't break formation to execute torpedo attacks, even when perfect opportunities presented themselves. At the Battle of Kolombangara on July 13, 1943, American destroyers firing from fixed screening positions achieved exactly 0 torpedo hits against Japanese forces, while Japanese long lances sank 1 cruiser and damaged 2 more. But some officers were studying the problem. Commander Arleigh Burke, who had assumed command of Destroyer Squadron 23 in late 1942, developed new tactical doctrine specifically for destroyer versus destroyer night actions. The core principle was simple but revolutionary. Destroyers should operate independently, not as cruiser escorts. They should use radar to achieve surprise, execute torpedo attacks as their primary weapon, and follow up with gunfire only after the torpedoes struck home. Burke's doctrine required dividing the destroyer force into 2 divisions. The division that made radar contact first would maneuver into attack position and launch torpedoes. The second division would position itself to cross the enemy's projected course, creating a crossfire and preventing the enemy from turning into or away from the first division's torpedoes. Both divisions would hold fire with their guns until after the torpedoes detonated, preserving surprise and allowing maximum time to close the range. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding Destroyer Division 12 aboard USS Dunlap, had studied Burke's proposals. When Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, commanding Task Force 31, ordered Moosbrugger to intercept Japanese reinforcement runs to Kolombangara on August 5, 1943, Moosbrugger requested and received authorization to operate independently. No cruisers, no screening duties. Just 6 destroyers hunting Japanese destroyers, free to maneuver as the tactical situation demanded. Moosbrugger divided his force into 2 divisions. Division 12 consisted of USS Dunlap, USS Craven, and USS Maury, all equipped with full pre-war torpedo batteries. Maury and Craven carried 16 torpedo tubes each, 4 quadruple mounts that could fire 8 torpedoes per broadside. Dunlap carried 12 tubes in 1 centerline quadruple mount and 2 wing mounts. Together, the 3 ships could put 24 torpedoes in the water from a single salvo. Division 15, commanded by Commander Roger Simpson, included USS Lang, USS Sterett, and USS Stack. These ships had exchanged some torpedo capacity for additional 40mm Bofors guns, carrying only 2 quadruple mounts each, but they retained enough torpedoes for effective attacks. More importantly, they carried excellent gun batteries that could engage any Japanese forces attempting to escape the initial torpedo strike. The tactical plan was elegant. Division 12 would approach from the shadow of Kolombangara Island, using the dark landmass as background to mask their silhouettes. They would fire torpedoes at maximum effective range, approximately 5,000 yards, then turn away to reload and prepare for a second attack if necessary. Division 15 would position themselves 4,000 yards to the west, ready to intercept any Japanese ships that turned away from the first torpedo spread. If the Japanese turned toward Division 12 to engage with guns or torpedoes, they'd expose their broadsides to Division 15. If they turned away, they'd run straight into Division 15's guns. The Japanese, meanwhile, operated under assumptions that had worked perfectly for 20 months. Captain Sugiura's force consisted of 4 destroyers, IJN Shigure, IJN Hagikaze, IJN Arashi, and IJN Kawakaze. Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze each carried 300 troops plus supplies for the garrison at Vela on Kolombangara's southern tip. Shigure, unburdened by troops, provided escort. The plan called for entering Vela Gulf from the north, transiting down the strait between Kolombangara and Vela, then depositing the troops and supplies into barges at the entrance to Blackett Strait for the final leg to Vela. Japanese planning assumed the nearest American surface forces would be concentrated at the southern end of Kula Gulf, the more direct approach to Vela. Vela Gulf offered a longer route but better concealment from American radar-equipped PT boats. The Tokyo Express had run similar missions successfully 3 times in the preceding 2 weeks. On August 1st, 4 destroyers had evaded 15 PT boats, delivering 900 troops and 120 tons of cargo, while sinking PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, in the process. Sugiura expected PT boats. He expected possible air attack at dawn. He did not expect American destroyers lying in wait in the middle of Vella Gulf, because American doctrine up to this point had never positioned destroyer forces this aggressively. The Americans had always reacted to Japanese movements. They'd never preemptively positioned ambush forces in the middle of a transit route the Japanese considered secure. At 23:33 on August 6th, USS Dunlap's SG radar painted 4 contacts at 22,000 yards, bearing north. Moosbrugger studied the formation. 4 ships in column, maintaining steady course and speed. Japanese destroyers, almost certainly. The range closed steadily as both forces converged. Moosbrugger ordered Division 12 to turn to course 335 degrees, angling toward an intercept point that would place his ships at optimal torpedo range. The Japanese continued south, unaware. Their lookouts scanned the darkness, searching for PT boats or the phosphorescent wakes of incoming torpedoes. But visibility was terrible, clouds covering the quarter moon, and the American destroyers were still invisible against the bulk of Kolombangara Island behind them. At 23:41, range had decreased to 5,500 yards. Moosbrugger gave the order. Fire torpedoes. USS Dunlap loosed 8 Mark 15s from her 2 wing mounts, holding her centerline mount in reserve. USS Maury and USS Craven each fired 8 torpedoes, for a total of 24 weapons in the water, running at 45 knots toward the Japanese column. Moosbrugger immediately ordered his division to turn away, reversing course to clear the area. Standard doctrine called for launching torpedoes and then maintaining course to observe results, but that invited return fire. Burke's new tactical doctrine emphasized surprise and survival. Launch, turn away, let the torpedoes do their work. The Japanese couldn't shoot back at what they couldn't see. The 3 American destroyers completed their turn and steadied on a southerly course, putting distance between themselves and the attack point. Division 15, 4,000 yards to the west, maintained position, waiting. Aboard USS Lang, Commander Simpson watched his radar plot and prepared to engage with guns the moment the torpedoes detonated. 45 seconds. That's how long a Mark 15 torpedo needs to travel 5,000 yards at 45 knots. Moosbrugger counted in his head, watching the chronometer. The Japanese still showed no sign of having detected the attack. Their formation remained steady. No turn, no flares, no searchlights. Then the night exploded. USS Hagikaze took at least 2 torpedoes in her forward section. The detonations ripped open her hull from bow to bridge, and she burst into flames immediately. USS Arashi caught multiple hits amidships, probably 3 torpedoes striking within seconds of each other. Her fire rooms flooded instantly, boilers exploding from the sudden influx of seawater. She lost all power and began settling by the stern. USS Kawakaze received a hit near her after magazine. The explosion was catastrophic, detonating stored ammunition and torpedoes. She rolled over and sank in less than 4 minutes. Only IJN Sugiura escaped. A Mark 15 torpedo struck her rudder but failed to detonate, a mechanical malfunction that saved the ship and her crew. Commander Tameichi Hara, Sugiura's captain, later described the attack in his post-war memoirs. His first indication of danger came when lookouts spotted torpedo wakes 30 seconds before impact. He ordered emergency full speed and hard rudder, but there wasn't time. The torpedo hit the rudder, passed through without exploding, and exited out the stern. Hara immediately ordered maximum speed and turned away into the darkness, firing 8 torpedoes blindly in the direction he thought the American ships might be. All 8 missed. Division 15 now entered the fight. USS Lang, USS Strait, and USS Stack turned to port, crossing ahead of the burning Japanese ships, and opened fire with their 5-inch batteries. Hagikaze and Arashi, already crippled by torpedoes, took additional hits from gunfire. Within minutes, both ships had stopped moving, their crews abandoning ship as fires consumed the superstructures. The entire engagement, from first radar contact to final gunfire, lasted less than 25 minutes. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, 900 Japanese soldiers drowned, along with 356 naval personnel, 0 American casualties, 0 damage to American ships. Moosbrugger radioed his contact report to Admiral Wilkinson. 3 enemy destroyers sunk, own forces undamaged. The laconic report understated what had just occurred. For the first time in the Pacific War, American destroyers had defeated Japanese destroyers in a night torpedo action. Not defeated, annihilated. The Japanese hadn't gotten off a single effective shot before 3/4 of their force went to the bottom. The tactical implications reverberated immediately through both navies. At Rabaul, Japanese, Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters received Sugiura's fragmentary report and struggled to understand what had happened. How had American destroyers achieved such complete surprise? How had they positioned themselves perfectly for a torpedo ambush in the middle of a transit route? The report spoke of massive torpedo spreads appearing from nowhere, striking before Japanese lookouts even saw American ships. It didn't match any American tactical doctrine Japanese intelligence had documented. More critically, Japanese commanders realized they'd lost their qualitative edge in night combat. The psychological impact was enormous. For 20 months, Japanese destroyer crews had considered themselves superior to their American counterparts in night actions. They'd proven it repeatedly at Salvo Island, Tassafaronga, Kolombangara, but Vela Gulf shattered that confidence. 3 ships destroyed in minutes by an enemy they never saw. Survivors floating in burning oil described American destroyers, appearing out of the darkness like ghosts, firing coordinated torpedo spreads with a precision that suggested advanced knowledge of Japanese movements. Within a week, Japanese naval staff concluded that Kolombangara could not be held. The American destroyers had demonstrated they could interdict reinforcement runs with impunity. The Tokyo Express, which had kept Japanese garrisons supplied throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, was effectively finished. By early October 1943, Japan had evacuated Kolombangara, abandoning 12,400 troops who'd been built up at such cost. For the Americans, Vella Gulf validated everything Arleigh Burke and Frederick Moosbrugger had argued about destroyer tactics. Independent operation, radar-directed surprise attacks, torpedoes as the primary weapon, aggressive maneuver without waiting for cruiser commands. Admiral William Halsey called it the most brilliant action of its kind. The Naval War College's analysis termed it an example of how to win a sea battle. But the real revolution wasn't tactical, it was technological and doctrinal. The Fletcher-class destroyers had provided the platform, their 10 torpedo tubes, their radar, Their speed and endurance made the tactics possible. But equally important was the willingness to let destroyer commanders operate independently, free from the conservative doctrine that had hamstrung American forces in 1942. The Mark 15 torpedo, so often maligned for its defects earlier in the war, had performed flawlessly at Vella Gulf. 24 torpedoes fired, at least 8 hits, possibly more. The massive spread had overwhelmed Japanese evasive capabilities. Even with 30 seconds warning, the Japanese ships couldn't maneuver clear of that many weapons converging simultaneously. The Japanese long lance still outranged the Mark 15 by a factor of 3. But range didn't matter if you couldn't detect the enemy until his torpedoes. They were already in the water. American radar had neutralized the long lance's primary advantage by allowing American ships to attack from beyond visual range, launching torpedoes before Japanese lookouts spotted them. Fletcher-class destroyers carried SG surface search radar with a reliable detection range of 15 to 20 miles against destroyer-sized targets. The system, introduced in 1942, used a frequency that provided excellent resolution and wasn't significantly affected by sea clutter or weather. Operators trained to read the radar scopes could distinguish individual ships, estimate courses and speeds, and vector attacking forces into optimal positions. The Japanese had nothing comparable in mid-1943. They were developing radar, but operational sets were primitive, unreliable, and not yet widely deployed. Commander Arleigh Burke, studying the after-action reports from Vela Gulf, refined his doctrine further. He'd taken command of destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers, in late October 1943, just as the Bougainville campaign was beginning. His squadron consisted of 5 Fletcher-class destroyers: USS Charles Osborne, USS Claxton, USS Dyson, USS Converse, and USS Spence. These ships would prove Burke's concepts in battle after battle over the next 4 months. Burke drilled his crews relentlessly on radar-directed night attacks. He established procedures for rapid torpedo fire control based on radar data alone, without visual contact. He developed hand signals and voice procedures that allowed his combat information centers to communicate targeting data to torpedo directors in seconds rather than minutes, and he emphasized speed. His destroyers operated at maximum sustainable speed whenever enemy contact was possible, earning Burke the nickname 31-knot Burke, after an engagement where boiler problems limited one ship to that speed. The test came on November 25, 1943, Thanksgiving night. Japanese intelligence had learned that American air attacks had rendered the airfield at Buka, north of Bougainville, inoperative. They needed to evacuate 700 aviation personnel and replace them with 920 fresh army troops. 5 destroyers were assigned. IJN Amagiri, IJN Ugiri, and IJN Uzuki would transport the troops, while IJN Onami and IJN Makinami provided escort. Burke's squadron was at Purvis Bay, refueling, when Admiral Theodore Wilkinson received intelligence that Japanese destroyers were heading for Buka. Wilkinson ordered Burke to intercept. The Little Beavers cast off their fuel lines and raced north, 5 destroyers against 5, both forces roughly equal in firepower. But Burke had something the Japanese didn't: 3 months of intensive training in the tactics pioneered at Vella Gulf. Destroyer Division 45, his own division, would execute the torpedo attack. Destroyer Division 46, under Commander Bernard Austin, would provide gunfire support after the torpedoes struck. 9 PT boats under Commander Henry Farrow patrolled near Buka Passage as backup, but Burke intended to handle this himself. The Japanese completed their mission around midnight on November 24th to 25th. Troops disembarked, aviation personnel embarked, and the 5 destroyers formed up for the return transit to Rabaul. Captain Kyoto Kagawa, commanding the escort destroyers from IJN Onami, assumed the Americans would be concentrated near Cape Torokina on Bougainville's west coast, not this far north. He was wrong. At 0141 on November 25th, USS Dyson's SG radar painted contacts at 22,000 yards, bearing northeast. Burke studied the plot. 5 ships in formation, the the spacing suggesting two groups, probably two escorts leading three transports. Range decreased steadily as the Japanese steamed west toward Cape St. George, the southern tip of New Ireland. Burke manoeuvred his division to intercept. The Japanese course would bring them within 5,000 yards if Burke timed his approach correctly. He ordered Division 45 to increase speed to 30 knots, closing the range while maintaining radar contact. Division 46 took position 6,000 yards to the southwest, ready to engage after the torpedo attack. At 01:55, range had dropped to 5,500 yards. Burke gave the order. USS Charles Osborne, USS Claxton, and USS Dyson fired 15 Mark 15 torpedoes toward the two Japanese escort destroyers. Then Burke ordered emergency turn to starboard, his ships heeling over as they reversed course to clear the attack zone. The torpedoes ran true. At 0200, IJN Onami exploded and sank almost immediately, hit by multiple torpedoes. Captain Kagawa and his entire crew, 178 men, went down with the ship. IJN Makinami took at least one torpedo hit that disabled her engineering spaces. She lost power and began settling. Division 46 moved in. USS Converse and USS Spence closed the crippled Makinami and finished her with gunfire and additional torpedoes. Another 178 men killed. Burke's radar had already detected the three transport destroyers, now fleeing north at emergency speed. He ordered pursuit. The heavily loaded Japanese ships, carrying troops and supplies, couldn't match the Fletcher's speed. Burke's destroyers steadily closed the range, and at 0222 opened fire with their 5-inch batteries. IJN Ugiri became separated from the other two transports and found herself pursued by all three ships of Division 45. The engagement lasted over an hour, Ugiri twisting and turning, firing her remaining torpedoes in desperation. All missed. At 0328, overwhelmed by gunfire, Ugiri capsized and sank. 169 men killed, though Japanese submarine I-1, 77 would later rescue 279 survivors. IJN Uzuki and IJN Amagiri escaped into the darkness. Burke considered pursuit, but calculated the risks. His ships were 155 miles from Rabaul. Dawn would bring Japanese air attacks from that massive base. He'd already sunk 3 enemy destroyers with 0 American casualties. Pushing his luck by chasing the survivors into aircraft range seemed tactically unsound. At 0404, Burke called off the pursuit and turned south. The Battle of Cape St. George, as it became known, cemented the tactical revolution begun at Vella Gulf. Admiral Halsey called it one of the most brilliant actions of the war. The Naval War College termed it an almost perfect surface action. Burke had intercepted a Japanese force, achieved complete surprise through radar-directed approach, destroyed 3/5 of the enemy ships, and withdrawn without a scratch. Japanese survivors described the attack as terrifying. Torpedoes appeared from nowhere. American destroyers seemed to know exactly where the Japanese ships would be. The coordination suggested either supernatural prescience or some intelligence advantage the Japanese couldn't identify. What they didn't understand was that radar had fundamentally altered the tactical environment. Visual contact no longer mattered. Darkness no longer protected. The side with better sensors controlled the night, and the Fletcher-class destroyers, with their SG radar and trained operators, owned that advantage. Between August and November 1943, American destroyer tactics had evolved from defensive screening to offensive hunting. Fletcher-class destroyers, with their 10 torpedo tubes and radar-directed fire control, had become the primary surface combat units of the Pacific Fleet. They'd proven they could defeat Japanese destroyers consistently in night actions, the one domain where Japanese forces had previously dominated. The mathematics of the revolution was simple. A Fletcher-class destroyer division with 3 ships carried 30 torpedo tubes. A coordinated attack could put 30 warheads in the water simultaneously, creating an overwhelming threat that no amount of Japanese lookout skill or seamanship could evade. And if the first salvo missed or achieved only partial success, the Fletchers could reload in 20 to 30 minutes and attack again. Something earlier American destroyers with smaller crews and more cramped spaces couldn't accomplish rapidly. The Japanese recognized the changed equation, but couldn't counter it effectively. They attempted to develop radar equivalents, but American industrial capacity had given the US Navy a sensor advantage that would persist through the end of the war. They tried concentrating destroyer forces to overwhelm American formations through numbers, but that required coordination the Japanese command structure couldn't consistently achieve after the losses of 1943, and they attempted to avoid night surface actions entirely, but that meant ceding control of the seas around the Solomon Islands to American forces. By December 1943, the Tokyo Express had effectively ceased operations. Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomons could no longer be reinforced or resupplied by destroyer runs. The isolation of Rabaul, the primary Japanese naval base in the southwest Pacific, had become inevitable, and Fletcher-class destroyers, operating in squadron strength with doctrine refined through combat, had been the decisive factor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ultimate test of the Fletcher-class destroyer's torpedo capability came on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1944, in Surigao Strait, Philippines. The Battle of Vela Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, was reaching its climax. Japanese forces had attempted a three-pronged assault on American amphibious forces in Vela Gulf. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet had been lured north by Japanese carriers. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet faced two Japanese surface forces attempting to penetrate Vela Gulf from the south and north. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded the Seventh Fleet's Fire Support Group, 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 26 destroyers. His mission was to defend Surigao Strait, the narrow passage between Leyte and Dinagat Island, through which Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would attempt to transit. Nishimura's force was formidable. 2 battleships, IJN Yamashiro and IJN Fuso, both displacing over 30,000 tons and armed with 12 14-inch guns. Heavy cruiser IJN Mogami, 4 destroyers. Against this heavy force, Oldendorf positioned his battleships across the northern end of the strait in a classic crossing the T formation. But before the battleships could engage, he unleashed his destroyers. 3 destroyer squadrons, operating independently, would attack in sequence from the flanks. Destroyer Squadron 54 under Captain Jesse Coward would attack from the east. Destroyer Squadron 24 under Captain K.M. McMahons would attack from the west. Destroyer Squadron 56 under Captain Roland Smoot would attack from ahead, positioned to catch any Japanese ships attempting to evade the flank attacks. The Japanese entered Surigao Strait around midnight, their formation silhouetted against the dark water by the occasional star shell from PT boats harassing them from the sides. They were steaming into a death trap, and they didn't realize it until too late. At 0254, Destroyer Squadron 54 initiated its attack. 5 destroyers, USS Reme, USS McGowan, USS Melvin, USS McDermott, and USS Monson, maneuvered into position 3,000 yards from the Japanese column. At 0301, they fired 47 Mark 15 torpedoes in rapid succession. The water erupted with torpedo wakes, dozens of phosphorescent trails converging on the Japanese battleships. Nishimura saw them coming and ordered evasive maneuvers, but it was too late. Multiple torpedoes struck IJN Yamashiro, flooding compartments and reducing her speed. At least 2, possibly 3 torpedoes hit IJN Fuso, breaking her back. The great battleship broke in 2, both sections remaining afloat temporarily but no longer combat effective. Japanese destroyers IJN Asagumo and IJN Mikishio took torpedo hits and fell out of formation. Destroyer Squadron 24 attacked from the opposite flank at 0308. 6 destroyers, including Australian HMAS Arunta, fired additional torpedoes at the damaged Japanese formation. More hits. IJN Yamashiro staggered under successive explosions. The cruiser Mogami maneuvered wildly, avoiding torpedoes by meters. Destroyer Squadron 56 delivered the final blow. Captain Smoot positioned his destroyers directly ahead of the advancing Japanese column, deployed in 3 sections to ensure, as Smoot phrased it, the enemy would pass through torpedo waters no matter which way he turns. His destroyers fired another spread of torpedoes at 0330. By 0345, when Oldendorf's battleships opened fire from 14,000 yards, Nishimura's southern force had been decimated. Both battleships crippled by torpedo damage. 3 destroyers sunk or sinking, the cruiser Mogami heavily damaged. Only destroyer IJN Shigure remained combat effective, the same ship that had miraculously survived Vela Gulf 15 months earlier. The battleship engagement lasted 20 minutes. IJN Yamashiro, already mortally wounded by torpedoes, capsized and sank at 0419, taking Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew to the bottom. IJN Mogami, blazing from stem to stern, retreated south and would be finished off by American aircraft the next morning. The decisive weapons at Surigao Strait were torpedoes, not battleship guns. American destroyers had fired approximately 90 Mark 15 torpedoes during the 3 sequential attacks. Japanese records after the war confirmed at least 22 hits on various ships. The torpedo attacks had broken the Japanese formation, slowed the battleships, sunk 3 destroyers, and reduced Nishimura's force to wreckage before the American battle line ever engaged. Surigao Strait was the last battleship versus battleship action in naval history, but the battle is more accurately remembered as a destroyer action. 26 American destroyers, most of them Fletcher class, executing coordinated torpedo attacks in the restricted waters of a narrow strait, destroying a superior force through tactics, technology, and training. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized battleship-centric operations throughout the war. The battleship was the ultimate expression of naval power, the ship around which task forces were organized. But Surigao Strait demonstrated that in modern naval warfare, where radar allowed precise targeting and destroyers carried enough torpedoes to saturate a battleship's defensive capabilities, the destroyer had become the dominant surface combatant. Captain Jesse Coward's Destroyer Squadron 54 fired 47 torpedoes and achieved at least 5 hits, sinking 1 battleship and 3 destroyers. It was probably the most successful destroyer torpedo attack in naval history, measured by immediate tactical results. Coward's ships were all Fletcher class: USS Reme, USS McGowan, USS Melvin, USS McDermott, USS Monson, 5 ships, 50 torpedo tubes, 47 weapons fired in a single coordinated attack. The Japanese Navy never recovered from the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Between October 23rd and 26th, 1944, they lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 of destroyers. Surigao Strait accounted for 2 of those battleships and several destroyers. But beyond the material losses, the Japanese lost their ability to contest American naval supremacy in the Western Pacific. Fletcher-class destroyers had been decisive in that outcome. Between Vela Gulf in August 1943 and Surigao Strait in October 1944, they'd revolutionized surface warfare. Their 10 torpedo tubes, arranged in 2 quintuple mounts, allowed them to deliver overwhelming firepower in single salvos. Their radar gave them targeting information the Japanese couldn't match. Their speed and endurance let them operate independently, hunting enemy forces rather than reactively screening friendly ships. The specifications of the Fletcher-class torpedo armament reveal why these ships transformed surface warfare. Each destroyer carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts, positioned on the center line. This arrangement provided several advantages over earlier designs that mounted torpedoes on wing mounts or in fixed positions. Centerline mounts could train to either beam, giving the ship flexibility to engage targets on either side without maneuvering. The quintuple mount itself was a mechanical marvel. 5 21-inch diameter tubes arranged in a trainable mount, with an impulse charge system that launched torpedoes pneumatically using compressed air. Trained crews could reload all 5 tubes in approximately 20 to 30 minutes, an impressive feat given that each Mark 15 torpedo weighed 3,000 pounds loaded. The Mark 15 torpedo carried 661 pounds of Torpex explosive. Range varied by speed setting: 6,000 yards at 45 knots on high-speed setting, 15,000 yards at 26 knots on low-speed setting. Most destroyer attacks in the Solomon Islands used the high-speed setting, accepting reduced range in exchange for shorter running time and better hit probability. By mid-1943, when Fletcher-class destroyers began executing large-scale torpedo attacks, the Mark 15 was functioning reliably. The torpedo still wasn't perfect. Dud rates of 5 to 10% persisted throughout the war, but it was effective enough for mass attacks where even a 50% hit rate would produce devastating results. The torpedo fire control system aboard Fletcher-class destroyers represented a significant improvement over earlier installations. The Mark 27 torpedo director incorporated gyro stabilization that compensated for the ship's pitch and roll. Directors could receive target bearing, range, and speed data directly from the SG radar plot in Combat Information Center, enabling attacks without visual contact. Radar operators in CIC detected enemy ships and tracked them long enough to establish course and speed. That data fed to the torpedo director officer on the bridge, who input the information into a mechanical computer that calculated the required gyro angle for each torpedo. The entire process, from initial radar contact to torpedo launch, could take as little as 10 minutes for a well-drilled crew. Commander Arleigh Burke's Little Beavers achieved launch times of 7 to 8 minutes during their battles in late 1943. Japanese destroyers lacked equivalent fire control systems. They relied primarily on visual targeting, with range and bearing estimated by trained observers, using optical rangefinders. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes had superior range and warhead size, but without radar-assisted targeting, they couldn't capitalize on that advantage at night. The contrast was stark. American destroyers detected targets at 15 to 20 miles using radar, close to optimal firing range while maintaining precise tracking data, and launched coordinated spreads with targeting solutions calculated mechanically. Japanese destroyers had to close to visual range, maybe 5 to 8 miles on a clear night, estimate target parameters by eye, and fire based on experienced guesswork. The technological gap had become decisive. The casualty statistics reflect this disparity. At Vela Gulf, 3 Japanese destroyers sunk with over 1,200 men killed, 0 American casualties. At Cape St. George, 3 Japanese destroyers sunk with approximately 600 men killed, 0 American casualties. At Surigao Strait, Japanese forces lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers, with thousands killed. American destroyer forces suffered 39 killed, mostly aboard USS Albert W. Grant, which had been hit by friendly fire during the confused night action. The differential wasn't luck. It was the product of superior sensors that allowed American forces to attack from positions of advantage, superior tactics that emphasized surprise and overwhelming firepower, and superior ships that provided the speed, endurance, and weapon capacity to execute those tactics successfully. Production numbers tell the story of American industrial mobilization. Between 1942 and 1944, 11 different shipyards constructed 175 Fletcher-class destroyers. The ships rolled out at rates approaching 3 per month at peak production, faster than Japan could possibly build replacements for the destroyers American forces were sinking. Japanese destroyer construction never matched American production. Between 1941 and 1945, Japan completed approximately 63 destroyers of all classes. The United States commissioned 175 Fletchers alone, not counting other classes that added hundreds more destroyers to the fleet. The legacy of the Fletcher class extended decades beyond World War II. Many Fletcher destroyers remained in service with the U.S. Navy through the 1970s. Others were transferred to Allied navies worldwide. The last, Fletcher in active service, Bam Quitlahuac, formerly USS John Rogers, served in the Mexican Navy until 2001, 59 years after the first Fletcher was commissioned. 4 Fletchers survive today as museum ships: USS Kidd in Baton Rouge, USS Cassin Young in Boston, USS The Sullivans in Buffalo, and USS Laffey in Charleston. These preserved ships allow visitors to walk the same decks where crews fought the battles that won the Pacific War. The Arleigh Burke class of Aegis destroyers, the backbone of today's U.S. Navy surface combatant force, carries the name of the destroyer squadron commander, who perfected Fletcher-class tactics. These modern ships embody the same tactical philosophy, use superior sensors to detect threats at maximum range, engage decisively with overwhelming firepower, operate independently or in small groups. The question posed by the title captures a fundamental truth. Japanese naval doctrine in 1942 had been built around assumptions about American capabilities that were rendered obsolete by technological progress and tactical evolution. They'd prepared to fight the American Navy of 1941. They encountered the American Navy of 1943, equipped with radar, guided by aggressive doctrine, and building ships at rates Japan couldn't match. The Fletcher-class destroyer, more than any other single ship type, embodied that transformation. 175 ships, 10 torpedo tubes each. Those 2 quintuple mounts, with their Mark 15 torpedoes and radar-directed fire control, allowed destroyers to engage and destroy enemy forces that previous doctrine would have required cruisers or battleships to handle. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.